Hello friends, Tom Mullen here, and it is my distinct pleasure to be talking with Republican Congressman and presidential candidate Ron Paul of Texas. Dr. Paul, thank you for being with me.
You're welcome. Nice to be with you.
Congressman Paul, much of the Republican establishment seems to be saying a lot of the things that you've been saying on foreign policy since the 1970s. Do you think that they're just trying to appeal to your base, or they've realized that the fiscal problems are going to force the issue, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's not so much that they think, well, how do we appeal to Ron Paul's base, as much as the base of the Republican Party is sort of changing their opinion, and they're less anxious to go to all these wars. So it's a good thing that's happening. It's not based on real principle, but it's the principle the people are sending a message to Congress, and this is good. So I would say that the country is moving certainly in a different direction. The money has a lot to do with it too, because we're out of money. And I used to kid, but pretty serious too. I would say I'm going to win this argument on foreign policy, but it's not because of my great speeches. It's going to be because we're going to be flat out broke, and we'll have to retrench. And that's the way great empires always go. They usually lose steam because of economic reasons, just as we recently seen with the Soviet system. It collapsed for economic reasons, not because we had to fight a real hot war with them, and the system collapsed. But we're working our way in that direction. So eventually the empire will end. I'm just trying to make sure it ends more gracefully than with a collapse of our economy.
And one of the things that happened to the Soviet system was also a collapse of the currency, which is something that you've been warning about for quite a while. Now, for people new to monetary policy, maybe hearing it from you for the first time, even if the system works, it's really still what they call a wealth redistribution system, what we call in plain English stealing. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, there was a study done by an individual not too many years ago, and the claim of his results was that essentially every war is fought by inflation. Inflation means the creation of new money. In the old days, they clipped coins or diluted the metal, and today we call it printing press money, but it's not even printing, it's just getting money out of a computer. But any of these techniques will devalue the currency, depreciate the currency. The dollar buys less, because people generally don't like to pay for what wars really cost. And they've also been deceived into believing that wars are good for the economy. And too many people were taught that the Depression ended with World War II. And those are all fallacy. They're myths. But a lot of people believe that, so there's not that much resistance. But when you have war and you pay for it through inflation, it's very, very damaging to the economy. And even if you did pay for it, it's very damaging because you produce goods that are blown up. And it's usually there's an accumulation of debt, debasement of the currency, and eventually it will hurt the economy, especially if you're spread too thinly around the world like we are now. Short, deliberate wars that you fight for 3 or 4 years and then they end and you can retrench, they're not quite as bad to the economy as when you get bogged down and the wars drag on and it's a heavy burden on the economy. And the real irony, sad irony, is the fact that bin Laden announced that's exactly what he was going to do to us. He says, I'll get the Americans to come over here and bog them down and give them a bankruptcy at home. And it looks like he may be laughing in his grave at us because we did exactly what he had wanted us to do.
Now, even during peacetime, if the Federal Reserve does exactly what they say they're supposed to do, which is create full employment, the only way that they can do that, of course, is by getting that purchasing power from somebody else as well. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it's theft. When you redistribute wealth, I think a lot of us believe that government is participating in the theft. But the theft through inflation is more seductive, and it's evil. And the founders didn't like it. Matter of fact, they said if you counterfeit the money or debase the currency, the penalty will be death. That's how strongly they felt about it. So the debasement of currency is theft. It takes money from one person, delivers it to another. The Austrian economists have always said that if you destroy the currency, you destroy the middle class. But if you have a healthy, vibrant economy, there's a lot more wealth and it's more fairly distributed, but you still have the rich and you still have the poor. But if you want maximum amount of wealth and the best distribution, you go with the free market and a strong middle class. But how many people now complain about what's happening in the middle class? And the best way to see this is not only through the inflationary transfer of funds, but what about on the bailout? Well, you could see it literally, where both Congress and the Federal Reserve bailed out the very wealthy who got into trouble and they should have gone bankrupt, and who ended up getting the depression. Many people in the middle class, they lost their jobs and they lost their homes, and they couldn't pay their mortgages. So we're on the verge of destroying our middle class. So whether the spending comes from war or welfare, or especially both, it will end badly, no matter how much credit you give to those who promote it for good reasons. Many who promote war actually believe, it's necessary to protect our safety and security. And that's why we have Patriot Acts and TSA to protect our safety and make sure that nobody will harm us. Same way with many of the liberal do-gooders. They say, well, we care about a safety net. We care about people. But if you look at the results, they're lousy. The extreme of intervention and extreme of welfarism is the communist system and socialist systems, and they go broke. And nobody gets anything. Then they end up with chaos and a breakdown, and then they have to come up with a new system. Because when the money quits working, you do have political chaos, and we've been getting away with it for a long time because we've been a strong nation, we've been very wealthy, and we've had the ability to borrow. But the borrowing, which we're living on now, is coming to an end. So therefore, we have to face the consequences of our past errors that we have made in our economic system by spending and living way beyond our means, which is forcing us now to live beneath our means.
On the subject of safety nets, Ann Coulter recently wrote a piece in which she stated that you're only interested in cutting military spending and fighting government domestic policy on marriage or drugs. And I'm quoting her article here. She says, Paul can't even scratch Social Security and Medicare off that list by taking the libertarian position that there should be no Social Security or Medicare, because he also said during the debate, and now she's quoting you, we don't want to cut any of the medical benefits for children or the elderly because we have drawn so many in and got them so dependent on the government. Now, I thought I heard you say that you wanted to let young people opt out of Social Security and Medicare. So can you clarify that?
She can't comprehend that because she's a war person. So if you're spending $1 trillion operating an empire around the world and they don't want to cut it, then they don't see any way they can bring this together. No, I wouldn't have voted for any of those programs. I don't believe in them because they eventually give us what we have, a bankrupt system, and people are on the verge of losing everything, their Social Security and medical benefits. But that doesn't mean I'm not willing to work for a transition program. So I'm not going to cut child health care as a way to balance a budget. And too many conservatives will do that. Some domestic program, they'll cut it, but they won't cut a penny out of the military. And she calls that defense. I don't call it defense. I call it that thing called militarism and the military-industrial complex, of which Eisenhower warned us about. It's military Keynesianism. So they spend this money and they won't cut anything. But and it's ironic, I don't believe in those systems. I think they're going to end badly, but I've worked hard to try to make them work, in that I've never voted to spend one nickel out of Social Security and spend it on these wars. So if they'd have voted like I have, there'd have been money in the bank. It would have been, not as good as a private system, but it could have worked. But unfortunately, you can't trust governments, and that's the reason it didn't work. But at least I didn't vote to spend any of that money. At the same time, I had legislation that would prohibit the Congress from spending the money that are in the so-called trust funds. So if we collect money, from gasoline taxes and put it in a highway trust fund, they shouldn't be spending that. They should be, you could run the transportation office with one person, just send back the percentage to each state and say, take care of your highways, we collected the money for you. But Others who are critical, you know, they don't hesitate for a minute to spend that money for things like the war, and then they come back and carp at you for saying that, well, where do you stand? And they accuse you of all sorts of things that I think they're the ones who are inconsistent.
So to clarify your plan, you would let the young people opt out, and the money that they would be paying in would be replaced by the money we save overseas.
And it would be tough. It wouldn't be, you could save hundreds of billions from the military funding, but it probably still wouldn't be enough. But why couldn't we get the conservatives who are always complaining, why couldn't we get rid of the Department of Education, get rid of the Department of Energy, get rid of the Department of Commerce, get rid of most of what's in Homeland Security, get rid of the TSA. I mean, we could save a lot of money, but you know, I just still would try to say that, you know, if you have an elderly person who doesn't have a family and they've been taught to be dependent, and even though they would have been taken care of in a free society like they did before 1965, churches took care of them and families took care of them and people weren't lying out in the streets with no medical care. But we don't have that now. So I would work hard to try to take care of those people. And I think that if we did it in a calm, deliberate fashion, maybe we could work our way out of it. But yes, I would offer the young people a chance to opt out. People talk about opting out of Obamacare because it's atrocious, but what about opting out of the Republican prescription drug program and all the other programs? I think we should always have an option to get out, whether it's the medical care program or opting out of the public school system. Make sure we're always allowed to have private schools and always have homeschooling, but some people would like to stop that. They don't want any competition with government.
Now, in another interview with Matt Lauer on the Today Show, he suggested that Americans are starting to like some of your ideas, and then he said that some of them they might consider as fringe or whatever he phrased that.
It's that Constitution always getting in the way. Yeah. Those are the fringe ideas.
Now, you responded that economic liberty, personal liberty, and the foreign policy are all one package, and it seems to me that you're just applying what Thomas Jefferson would say was the non-aggression principle, or the definition of liberty itself. Isn't that right?
That is, and that's the moral principle. The legislative principle is really in the Constitution. The Constitution is far from perfect, but the abuse of it has been atrocious. So the Jeffersonians have sort of lost out, and the Hamiltonians have sort of taken over. And from the very beginning, they argued about that, whether it was central banking or debts and, you know, public expenditures. The argument started rather early on, and even the challenge to civil liberties, you know, with the Sedition Act and others that Jefferson didn't like, but others put in. So it is human nature, it seems, that even those who defended the Constitution and participated in it, once they became president, they weren't quite as good as they were. And of course, that's the argument for some, to say that we'd be much better off with the very, very smallest size government possible, because there's this temptation to abuse it. And of course, there were a lot that argued at the time of our Constitutional Convention that it was flawed because it would lead to a centralized government, and it certainly has. And certainly after the Civil War, it accelerated that trend, and then the Depression and Roosevelt and even Woodrow Wilson further accelerated that, to the point where even today, I think our government would be, if the founders saw us today, they would have no way they could identify what we have today in looking at the Constitution, because we have an executive branch that really runs everything, and a Congress that's sort of wimpish, and presidents get away with what they want, and we have courts that write laws, and we have an executive branch that writes all these regulations, which are law. That would be incomprehensible to the founders of the country and the writers of the Constitution.
Well, Woodrow Wilson said in his book, The New Freedom, that the idea that the government should be limited to just keeping us from harming each other just doesn't work anymore. Society's too complicated, and it's intolerable unless we let government do more. Do you think that maybe we've come to the end of that idea and maybe the original one might be better?
Oh, obviously it's a lot better, but his idea was it didn't seem to be working. Give in and let governments hurt each other. We're not supposed to each other, and the government's supposed to make sure we don't. But what he replaced it with was the idea that the government could hurt us, with the authoritarianism of an income tax, with a foreign policy that was making the world safe for democracy, with a Federal Reserve System that, took this license to deliberately and so-called legally debase the currency. So the government turned in to be the one, instead of protecting us, they're the ones who are injuring us. And of course, let's hope that there's a number of people changing their mind, and I get encouragement when I talk to a lot of young people. They seem to know something about this, and they would like another choice. I get encouragement from that because I do mention very clearly to them, and sometimes we can get large crowds out, at universities, that yes, if you want your freedom back, you also have to have your responsibilities. If you can't, if you take your freedoms and you have your right to your life and your liberty, you have a right to keep what you earn. You also, if you fail, you can't demand that your neighbor take care of you. And almost always I get a very positive response for that, because they're optimistic, because they're pessimistic about what they're getting, because they see difficulties getting jobs, endless debt, endless obligation to take care of the retiring generation, and they're outnumbered. So they like it, I think, when somebody champions their cause and giving them a chance to opt out of the system.
You said for a long time that we're coming to some sort of crisis, whether it's a debt default or a currency collapse. I know you don't have a crystal ball on your desk here, but after all that's over, where do you see America going in the future?
I think it's up for grabs. I know which way I want it to go, and I know why I'm involved. And I have some optimism because of the enthusiasm of young people, and an age group between 15 and maybe even up to 25 or 30, that group will make all those decisions. But the whole thing depends on what they think of the role of government ought to be. The founders did not like the role of the British government. They knew they wanted to get rid of that. But we have been very complacent, and we've accepted the fact that as long as we got more stuff, we didn't care what the role of government would be. And people became so materialistic, which was a result of our freedoms. They didn't care about our freedoms anymore. But then, instead of producing, they started just living off borrowed money, and that's coming in. So they have to make that decision. So I would say that if I thought there was zero chance, I wouldn't be in this fight. But I think there's a very good chance that things will come out better. I think Russia is better off today than they were when Stalin was in charge and killing millions of people, and they had an empire. Obviously, they still have their problems. I think we're better off than the Russian government and the Russian people, because our traditions have been so much better. We at least pay a little respect to our Constitution. We know what private property means. We know what sound money ought to be. We know what a contract is, and this means that we have a very good chance. But it's going to take some wringing out, and we could do it anytime we want, but politically it's very difficult. We could have done it in 2008. As crisis comes, it's total failure. Everybody go bankrupt, clean up your mess, and go back to work, and restore sound money, and change the rules again. But no, it was much easier to say, oh no, bankruptcy is bad. Those big banks are too big to fail. The little people they're okay. They can fail and they can lose their houses, but big guys can't. So they're prolonging the correction, but we still will face the correction, because everything we've done in these last 3 years has been put more weight on the dollar. So eventually there will be a dollar crisis.
But still some hope for the future.
Oh, absolutely. I think so, and people should be energized. There's more people like you around the country, more organizations. When I was in college, it was very, very hard to find good information. And then I relied a whole lot on the Foundation for Economic Education, Leonard Reed's group. But they were far and few between. There weren't that many groups. But today we have the internet and multiple groups. So I think that's why the message is spreading, and that's why I'm more hopeful.
Well, Dr. Paul, I know you're busy, and I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
All right.